Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle. This session is held in partnership with Indigenous initiatives at CTLT. We're very pleased to welcome Kim Haxton today to continue our series on connection and talk today about the role of an ally. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and all the sessions we have, and the CTLT team for putting together this fantastic space and providing all the refreshments. It's been really nice. A quick little reminder before we begin, some of the topics we covered today and in our sessions can be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If anybody following along online or those in the room need to engage in some self-care, talk to somebody, an elder, a friend, counselor, family member, whatever you need, we would encourage you to do that. So, on to team introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Tsawwatil First Nation, and I will be facilitating the session today. Other Learning Circle team members in the room, but off camera for the online audience, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Jordan, our assistant coordinator. The CTLT team is in the room. Can I ask you guys to stand up and just quickly introduce yourselves for everybody in the room?
Hi everyone, my name is Erin Yoon. I'm one of the educational consultants for CTLT Indigenous initiatives. And actually,
Awesome, thank you. So to catch everybody up to speed, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kim before we get started. Kim is the co-founder of Indigenous and is Potawatomi from the Wisconsin First Nation in Northern Ontario. Kim has a background in wilderness therapy and Aboriginal youth leadership development with degrees in geography and outdoor recreation. After 20 years of studying with Indigenous healers from Nepal, Thailand, Peru, Venezuela, Mexico, Belize, Haiti, and North America, she has become deeply involved in healing the community and the individual. She has extensive experience in trauma counseling training and applies this knowledge to her work with survivors of trauma, both immediate and ancestral. Kim brings a unique perspective to healing, combining both traditional and modern modalities, and she is convinced of the capacity of individuals and communities to enact their own healing through decolonization and reharmonization with nature. So with that, I think I'm kind of done here. I'm going to pass the mic over to Kim and we'll get started.
I'm like, who wrote that? That is so funny. Hi, everybody. That is so funny. I'm like, who's that person? That's not me. It is me. I want to welcome everybody here that's in the room and those people who are unseen, including our ancestors, the people out in the ether world. I want to welcome all bodies into the room, and that means everyone that's in here, all male-identified bodies, female-identified bodies, non-binary bodies, and any other body that exists. Really important that we all know that there's no right way to be a human and that we exist in this way. I also want to acknowledge, because there's a big thing right now about, as we're decolonizing our minds and on the way to be, is I also want to recognize all bodies physically, all the bodies like mine who are juicy like a berry, and all the bodies who are more built like a willow tree, who are strong and thin. Well, sort of, eh?
Relative.
It's all relative. And that's really important that we claim that, and honor that part of ourselves and who we are and how we exist in the world. Because our minds, we have this thing that we do, and forgive me for swearing right now, maybe this isn't, but it's really important. We have this thing called, and we call it the itty bitty shitty committee, right? And we all have that, and that's something that puts ourselves down or doesn't allow us to engage in relationships. So today we're going to be talking about allyship. And really, I was like, allyship, it's kind of a loaded word, and how a lot of the words that we use are loaded. But when I started thinking about, well, what is allyship? I was walking on the land, and because that's where I go to get all the answers, it's not me. And I realized that the forest is an intricate connection of relationships. And that really made me think about allyship, because we tend to be like gardens. This is my garden, keep off of it, don't pick my flowers. This is my garden, but we do it through our different cultures sometimes, And that's something that's broken down. And we're going to explore why those relationships are broken down. We kind of know that from the interesting assumptions that we have about each other to the places in which we hold internalized places about ourselves that keep us separated from each other, okay? And so what I would like to do is, there's a live audience this time, which is so much better than sitting in a little room with just a camera in your face. So I would like to do an experiential activity. And so it's a little bit awkward because we're going to have to move around. So please hold us as we do. And what's going to happen is everybody's going to stand up in a spot in the room so that there's room around you to walk, okay? And so we're going to spread out in here for the people in the room. And what's going to happen is I'm going to walk around, okay? Just wait a second. Yeah, wait a second. I'm going to walk around, and you're going to have your eyes closed when you find your spot, okay? And when you find your spot, you're going to have your eyes closed. And if I tap you, I'm going to walk around, and if I tap you twice, you can open your eyes and walk around the room. If I tap you once, you can just open your eyes, but you just stand there. And if I don't tap you, you have to stand with your eyes shut, okay? Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Pretty simple. So if I tap you twice, you can walk around. If I tap you once, open your eyes and stand still. If I don't tap you, just keep your eyes closed, okay? But everybody's gonna have their eyes closed. So please find a place in the room. Okay, so this is good for sound and Zoom. So I'm gonna ask everybody to close your eyes and take some nice deep breaths. This is one of the things that we've looked at with Indigenous is Dr. Michael Yellowbird's neurodecolonization. So one of it is about using your breath. One of the first relationships we have when we're born is our breath. And our breath is connected when you look at what's the word, epistemology? Is that the word? What's the root word? What's the special word for that? Somebody here?
Etymology.
Etymology, thank you. Etymology of the word breath is spirit. And that translates to many different cultures around the world. And so I'm asking people to connect with your breath. And it doesn't matter what's going on outside of you, just connect with yourself right now. And if I tap you twice, you can walk around the room. Okay, perfect. Can everybody open their eyes? So a big broad question, how did that feel?
Me.
Back to you, okay. So you were just standing, were your eyes open or closed? Closed, okay. I want to start with the people that were moving around the room and you had all the freedom to move around the room. How did that feel?
Privileged.
Privileged, yeah. What else did it feel like?
That's strange.
A little bit strange, why?
I don't know. Maybe because some people were watching and some people weren't.
Some people were watching, some people weren't. For the people who had no, or you could had your eyes open, how did you feel without moving?
I felt peaceful.
Peaceful, yeah.
Very much into the breath, like you said.
Yeah.
But it's strange to see you with your eyes closed. There's no relationship with you. You're right there.
Yeah, right? Anybody else who had their eyes open and didn't move?
There was that, certainly, but I also felt like a bit of a spy.
Okay.
Right? Like seeing things that some can't see, and it felt a little covert.
A little bit covert. Awesome. What about for the people who had your eyes shut? Or actually, I'm not going to go there yet. I'm going to ask the people who had the freedom to move around, why you didn't tap other people. You had the mobility to do it. Why didn't you reach over and tap people?
I felt like you had that power that I didn't.
You gave me that power.
Yeah.
Okay.
You were the one.
Right? Okay. I'm just going to have everybody to have a seat right now, and then we're going to go into this.
I wanted to open my eyes anyway and not listen to you.
Of
but
course.
then I wanted to be good.
I want it to be good, right? I want it to be good. These are really important things, right? I want it to be good, so I didn't do that, right? Okay. Did everyone have equal opportunities? No. Really simple, right? Really, really simple. How does this reflect to different people in our society? That's my question for you. How does this reflect, and in our communities and in our society, how does that reflect to what's going on in our communities and in our society? Yes.
Well, I think someone else mentioned that they didn't know they thought you had the power to tap, and that we didn't know that we had the freedom to tap other people. I think that reflects that not everyone knows that they have privilege or power.
Yeah. Right? Yes.
Building on what Jamie said, I thought if I was good, that I might be chosen. I look like I'm breathing really deeply.
Yeah.
Then I'll be chosen, right? And I thought it's so silly to say that, but then actually unpacking it in this context, now I feel like the lesson is like, if you follow along, then you can be integrated or you can be chosen,
Exactly, right? So there's an interesting thing about the things that we're trained into, because really all humans want to belong and be celebrated and be heard. It's a really simple thing from a little kid. I like it that you went down to being a little kid. I know when I first did this, I was like, pick me, pick me, pick me. They're not picking me. And I felt a little bit like, oh, man, that sucks, And then and then I was like, well, I'm going to open my eyes anyways, and gave a little stare around and felt really proud of myself for being a rebel, and I got busted, which was great, which turned out to be great for getting busted. So, but it's a difficult one. Over the years that I've done this, most people just say, well, you gave the rules. And I'm like, but who am I, right? And where do we give over our power instead of knowing what's the right thing to do? So in the time that I've come out, we've talked about what's the right thing to do. We're taught from here, especially within an academia context, right? There's certain unwritten rules to belong, right? And I want to share this story which I shared before, just as a quick one.
Sure.
And it goes like this. So. That one or the other? No, I'm going to go with that one. A long time ago, the creator had a gift for the humans and gathered all of the animals, all of the four-leggeds, the ones that slither on their bellies, the ones from the oceans, the ones that fly, the little ones that fly, and said, I've got this gift for the humans. We need to hide it. Eagle, being eagle, said, I'll take her to the moon. And creator's like, Matt, these two-leggeds are tricky. They're going to get there. Squid said, I'll take it to the deepest trench of the ocean. Creator said, no, they're going to get there, right? And so on this deliberation went until finally the little jumping mouse, I'm giving the really fast version of this, the little jumping mouse said, pss, 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 and Creator's like, that's where we'll put it, because they're going to spend lifetimes looking, right? They put it here. And there's a thing about that, because funnily enough, science discovered that the heart has intelligence, right? And that has neurons, has neurons. And it was, all of the wisdom cultures were like, oh, science, man, hurry up, right? Hurry up. And so there's a thing about that in regards to how we perceive the world and what we know, and how we are taught to behave, right? And how to be with each other. We know that the world's in a terrible place, and we also know that there's a lot of marginalized disparity between people. And I think I think there's a spiritual tenement to that of how we exist, of the spectrum of all possibilities in the universe. The universe is a really big place, so there's room for the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful, right? But there's a thing in which we are now on the earth creating such a destructive momentum, and we need to come together. And we're not. The way that the systems have set up, that we keep this marginalized place because it's like, oh, I can't do that. There's something about the heart, the teaching around the heart. When you look at sort of I don't know what the proper word would be. I don't even know what the proper word, but I'm going to use the word empathy. The heart teaches us empathy. I can have sympathy for somebody and be like, oh, poor you. But empathy is something in which I really connect and I'm moved by my heart because I see it, I feel it, and I know I need to do something, right? A lot of us are caught in a place where, oh yes, but, we live in a society, in our colonized society. Yesterday somebody was saying to me, but that's not all colonization. But I'm like, it is on a level where our minds have been colonized, When I look at Indigenous, as I've traveled around the world and lived with different Indigenous people who have a relationship with the natural world, which is a place of knowing, which just doesn't come from a rational place. Because I've been with scientists who are like, how did you know which plants to mix together? And that they're like, because they sing songs, and it's like, I don't hear that, or the seal hunters who stand around drinking tea, chitty-chatting, and then moments before a seal comes through 10 feet of ice, everybody goes silent. So there's a place in which I talk about, a place of knowing. Okay, that's really important. And it comes from this place. So when I talk about allyship, okay, I want to talk about a couple of things that happen with allyship. And it's a really interesting one, right? Because we get into these places around allyship. As I step onto this, I feel like a little bit of walking on eggshells, but why not? is we get into this place as well, I'm going to come and help you. The model that we've been taught and indoctrinated is, I'm going to come and help you. And they're like, why are they accepting my help? Because I have an agenda, right? I have an agenda to come and help you. And that's a different approach because it's like, it's not about that. It's about how do you build relationships, right? Because if I come in with, okay, here's the plan, and a lot of our organizations are set up in a place where it's kind of paternalistic. You'll get this funding, but you have to check off all the boxes, right? And so it's a place where we're like, okay, well, I need to do this. And then I see projects over and over and over that don't work, or people who come in to do research in communities, and there's a significant amount of tension, and I see it in the downtown east side where we're like, I hear people down there saying, we're tired of being studied, and I'm like, So where's the liberation for marginalized groups in all of us being allies with each other? Okay. And I thought about that, and I thought about the communities I've worked in, and I have drank so much tea in my lifetime with elders and eaten biscuits, you can tell, because it's about relationships. It's about building relationships first. So I started off saying, looking at the forest, right? When we look at the forest, it is a complex, it's complex pieces of relationships, and they all need each other, or the natural world. So the bear eats the salmon, the bear poops out salmon stuff, which feeds the berries, it's just this whole thing of the algae, it's a whole, everything is so related, and when I think about, okay, so how does that fit within our human context, right? How does that fit within our human context? And so there's a big question that comes up because we always get into this thing right now of polarizing, where it's like, and forgive me for saying this, I apologize right now for as I take you into maybe some uncomfortable places, but it's really important that we have this conversation. And the conversation comes into a place of around privilege. And I'm going to name it out as white privilege. And when I say that, I don't mean because of the color of your skin, but we're talking about power, we're talking about economics. we're also talking about a place in which a dominant culture, has come in. When we look at the word colonization, we know it's a resource extraction, and then a dominant culture comes in, and does their business, continues their business. So when I think about that, I'm like, so then if we've all been indoctrinated into, mine, me, my, how can we really have, I'm coming in because I've got a great idea, and it's been a tenement that we do all the time, as a parent. Like, there's an example, you have children. You want them to be a certain way. Your parents wanted you to be a certain way. And of course, you grew the way that you grew, with a lot of the good values or maybe that were passed on to you, but you didn't, we didn't always adhere to those things. So it's an interesting unconscious bias that we carry, whether or not it's from our family or whether or not it's from because we go to institutions from a very young age. If you live in North America, you go to school and you learn how to come into this place and how to be pick me. I'll be good. You can pick me, right? And yet we on our journey, it becomes a place where we have a very individualistic place in which we go with that, right? Does that make sense? Okay. For example, a dear friend of mine, and I hope if she's listening, I love you, I'm not going to say your name. I deserve my holiday. I'm going to Costa Rica. And I was like, ooh, hang on a second, let's reframe that. I didn't say that. She's like, oh, and then she looked at me, she said, oh, wait a second, let me think about that. I didn't have to say anything. And so it's an interesting thing that we do that, mine, and yet we live in a society where, there's things that are happening all over the world where there's huge problems. Here on our own territories, other territories like Syria, Yemen, and we're still like, oh, it's okay. Or, I spent time in the Democratic Republic of Congo and seeing young children who are working in the coltan, mining that, and yet I have a cell phone because I need a cell phone, and I'm just like, hang on a second. So there's a level of complicitness in which we live. But there's also a level of where we can also, with our privilege, take action. And most of us don't do that. We do it in little ways, but it's about our own ego, right? Mm-hmm. It's about ourselves rather than what do you need? How do we do that? And I see that in funding, how it comes down. Right. I see it in places. So when I talk about allyship, okay, I want to go to this place. Is like, first of all, what are you doing there? I've got my little notes that I was thinking about last night as I was in my bed, writing notes on my bed. And I'm like, oh, no, better. That's what computers are for. Is that, what do we need to do to create allyship? And the first one I talked about is about relationship, is making right relationships. Because a lot of time when you're coming into communities, you have all these good ideas. I want to help you. We look at gentrification, right? Where it's like, oh, this is a cool neighborhood. And then you change the neighborhood and people get outed, as an example. And it's like, hang on a second. It's kind of problematic, right? Mm-hmm. So allyship is in a place where, one, what are your relationships? What are your relationships within that community? I often ask that yesterday I was working with a group of people and I said, what are your relationships with Indigenous people from the land that you grew up on? And 80% of the people, I think, I didn't have any. I didn't know. Which I was like, yeah, a lot of people don't have a relationship, right? And so it's a thing that we started unpacking. And as I ask you that, what's your relationship with First Nations people or communities around you, and what does that look like, right? Mm-hmm. It could be, and that varies for so many different people on what that looks like. Holding space instead of trying to control outcomes, right? A lot of times I have been in places where people are speaking on behalf of, like I see it in the environmental movement, where people are speaking on behalf of Indigenous people. I'm like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not really an ally. I know you're a very, formidable person, but it's like, wait a second, there's people that have the ability to speak for themselves, And so it's important that when we're coming into other communities, that we're really there to listen. What happens is a lot of times is that people start feeling guilty because of your ancestors or something like that. And we get into these cycles of where we railroad what we were trying to help with because we make it about us, ourselves, right? So that's one of the things that I see over and over and over again when people are talking about being allies, when I'm working in people like mixed race, is people are like, oh, but my allies and me, and we talk about white guilt and white privilege and those things, and people get really triggered. And it's it's important that we do that work ourselves, so that you're not bringing in the emotional labor for the people who you're trying to serve, okay? Because let's look at the place of privilege. When people are sitting in pain, let's say in the downtown east side, as an example, and this is a broad brush because not everybody's in pain, okay, is that you can go home at night and you don't have to listen to the sirens, you don't have to listen to the screaming and yelling. That's the place of privilege. People live in those places on a daily basis. When I work in communities, we talk about how many more deaths I've been to of young people than I have of weddings and births. It's really tragic, you know. And so when we start thinking about that, it's like, well, yeah, you can walk away from it. I could walk away from it. And I remember feeling that when I was working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I was like, do I have a right to be here? Like, you know, I can leave this, you know, as much as there's beauty there, there's like, these stories are beyond what are humanly, not beyond humanly because they are happening, you know, but some of the stories that you're holding for people, you're like, how is this possible? You know, and I can leave there and come home to my world here. And that's privilege, right? And so when we're working with other groups, and it could be in a community garden, right? It could be anything within a context, is that it's like, yes, I'm, you know, hey, I'm going to help you, right? I'm going to help you, young man.
Mm-hmm.
And we come in with the best of intentions, but we also come in with agendas. And we don't come in, so it's like, does anybody here whitewater paddle? Or have you ever been on a river where it's white water? Okay, a couple of people, yeah. And when you watch people go like panic and they paddle, they're real fast and they flip over and it's like, it's no good, right? Because then you end up wet. But the whole technique around whitewater paddling is to slow down and back paddle. Then you can go slower than the water. And as you slow down, you can see what's going on. So it's like when you're building relationship, when we're talking about allyship, is that slow down. Because a lot of times we come into places and we have these ideas. I love this beautiful story. I heard on, I think, a radio show of this guy who was doing community development. He was from Italy and he was in Africa somewhere, and he was looking at all the rich soil around the riverbed, so he built this immense garden. He said tomatoes that grew little tiny things in Italy were giant tomatoes and everything. And he said just about before it got to harvest, the hippopotamuses came in and wiped out his garden. He was like, no, why didn't anybody tell me? And the old people said, well, because you didn't ask us, right? And it's such a thing. And I remember hearing that and being like, okay, even as an Indigenous person working in other Indigenous communities, which are different cultures from the one that I'm from, I have to learn the protocols and I have to learn, you know, what is the lay of this land? If I'm here to help to lift people up, it's a really important thing. So we talk about, there's a lot of lateral violence. You know, when we start unpacking colonization, I mean, I think it's the human experience of being like, that person, our judgy selves, you know, this part that projects on other people, that person is like this, or that person is like this, right? We get into those places. And so there's a piece in that where we cause violence, microaggressions. We see it on Facebook all the time. You know, you're either with us, you're against us, or how the media talks about the land protectors as protesters. And you know, I've gone to rent places and people are like, you're not one of those protesters, are you? And I'm like, oh. No, I don't protest, I actually protect, you know? Different. You're right. I'm not one of those protesters, right? But it's an interesting thing of how we reframe things. We need to reframe things. So when we talk about lateral violence, and it happens all the time with Indigenous communities, right? And you can go in there and you're probably gonna get hit, and you're not gonna get hit as well. But lateral violence happens, right? And that's the gossip. That's the put down, and so we talk about lateral liberation. right? And so this is an allyship, a really important concept to think about, is that you're coming in there and people are intimidated by you already sometimes because you're coming in maybe with education. I was with a group yesterday and somebody's like, I feel really uncomfortable because I have to go into spaces and everybody has some sort of title, academic title. And I'm like, are you kidding? Their work is valid as, your lifetime of living on the streets and living down here. You can have a PhD as far as I'm concerned of knowledge and understanding, and so we have this thing, right? As we've been placed where like, that's the itty bitty shitty committee of putting yourself down because you don't feel like you fit into the society that we've, as I talked about, that we've come to conform. So how can we build those relationships without you looking like a scary monster coming in, without you looking in that place? And so the questions, right? There's one is what is your thing? Are you having causing a problem or are you having impact in the community? So through the concept of lateral liberation, what does that look like? Yeah. I just want to see what else, if I put anything else down that was important. Yeah. Yeah. So the question then I would ask everybody is interested in allyship, what is it you're here to do? So that you're not coming in with your guilt and you're like, oh, I'm sorry. It normally happens a lot whenever I do, cross-cultural work and community people tell their stories and other people are like, oh, I'm so sorry, and when we talk about privilege and stuff like that. And it's like, hang on a second. What are you here to do? Because if you're not here to do the work to help liberate people, then you need to take time to process why you're coming into those spaces, right? So that you're not coming in to be like, oh, I can't help myself. I was working with somebody recently last year who's like, I can't help that I'm a rich white guy. And I was like, oh, we got some work to do. We got some work to do, okay? Holy, I don't know that's a loaded statement. It's a loaded statement. And it's a true thing that happened, and I'm just like, okay, we got some work because you got to go do some work first, and on all of that. Yeah. So I would like to open it up to questions.
Yeah, for sure. So for our online audience, if you have any questions for Kim about anything we just talked about, feel free to populate the chat box. I'll pass it over to Aaron and Janie if you guys want to kind of facilitate some discussion here. Does anybody have any questions from the live audience? Yeah, sure.
You mentioned something, and I'm going to try to quote it. Please forgive me if I don't get it right. In the DRC, you questioned whether you should be there. Do you have an answer to that question?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thanks for asking that. So it's kind of a bigger story, but I ended up there. Instead of doing a master's degree, I did a ceremonial apprenticeship with Indigenous cultures who haven't lost their pre-Columbian spiritual teachings instead, which my mother was like, you're going to do what? And I'm like, sorry, Mom. And because I'd been to a big institution previous and applied to be a volunteer with them, and they said to me, what do you know about post-traumatic stress disorder? And I'm like, as an Indigenous woman in Canada, are you kidding me? And they're a pretty big organization. And so off I went and going, maybe I need to do a master's. And this other door opened. And then another door opened from that one, which took me into opportunities to work in places like the DRC. And before I went to the DRC, I had seen in a ceremony that I was learning about judgment. And so I would see a moment of somebody in the downtown east side and being like, actually, she's okay. And then I would be taken out to the infinite place in which the universe is. And infinite is too big of a space for our brain boxes, right? Or we can't really hold what infinite is. And experiencing that and then back down. And one of the places I saw was, I didn't realize it at the time until I went there, was the Congo. It's funny to be talking about this in a very public forum, but I think it's really important too, as we're recalibrating how we view the world, which is a very limited scope, right? I was working in Haiti after the earthquake, and one of my mentors down there belongs to the Voodoo tradition, and I hadn't seen him in a year, and I had just been invited to go to the Congo, and I walked in, and he looked at me, and he said, oh, hi, hello, daughter. He said, the African spirits are really going to celebrate you, and you're going to be good. And how is it possible that this person knew that, right? How is it possible? Because I hadn't seen him. There's no possible way that he knew I was going to the Congo. And I knew at that moment that it was right. Although when I got there, I was doubtful. And then it was through another ceremony a few years later where the transmission I received from somebody else who looked at me and said, the African spirits are really happy that you're there. Which is an interesting one because rationally, all these big NGOs were like, you can't go there unless you have this and this, unless you have your own security team and this and that. And I'm like, oh, there's so much fear-based, I need to belong, I need to be good, right? And we uphold sticks of fear. And that keeps us separated, that keeps us all, going along in the right place. So it came from a spirit, it came from a sort of an unseen world. And that was where I was like, oh, this is the work. And it's not about, what I thought it would be. And there are seeds that we plant. There are seeds that we plant with each other all the time. Mm-hmm. Some of them take, and some of them don't, as you know, if you're a gardener, right? And it's frustrating sometimes where you're just like, I planted that and I loved you and you didn't grow. Okay. So that's my answer, is that it came from an unseen world, but it's interesting because there's still a part of me that's like, yeah, but I didn't get it from another human being saying, good, Kim, good work. It was from something that was like beyond what we're accustomed to, right? So that's a totally different topic, right? But I mean, there's a thing when we talk about decolonization, which is part of allyship, right? Is like unpacking the worldviews that we've been accustomed to. And so here's an example. Thompson Highway, a beautiful writer. I love his work. He was speaking at a talk in Toronto, and he said, in one worldview, there's a story about a man and a woman named Adam and Eve. He's super cheeky. And he goes, and in another world, and they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And he said, in another worldview, we never got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We don't have that story in our philosophy in the way that we are, And so there's an interesting thing when you start unpacking that, right? We come into this whole idea of square box, round hole in cultural philosophies and ways of seeing in the world or being in the world. And so when I talk about relationships, we come in going, oh, but we're all the same. Well, it's true. We all like to eat food. We all like to feel good, and but there's things that are philosophies and that are differences, right? So when we talk about appropriation, cultural appropriation is a really big one, and that's a really big one. And you'll get this from communities because it's like what happens generally is white people come in and take what they want from a culture and then take it out, and make money off of it. That happens a lot. And forgive me for saying that. That's a really broad brush saying that because I know not everybody is in that way, but I just want to. This is the attitude. So how do you build the relationship so people are like, you are a good guy. Come on in. You're one of us. You're going to eat food with us, right? That's one of the biggest things, in communities. I was laughing. I was just recently working up on Haida Gwaii is, and there's a thing where the greeting, right? A greeting is like, hey, how are you? The greeting, listen to this, is so beautiful. Are you round and full? Is the translation, right? I'm like, well, I like this place. Yes. Oh no, I'm not. No. But there's an interesting thing when we think about that, because we think in an English language, how are you? I'm fine, right? When you think of like, how is your health and how is your well-being? It's such a different way. And so I think it's a thing of, what are the customs? What are the places? When I see people who've married into some of the Haida community, there's a woman there who has learned, she's fluent in Haida, right? Her kids are all being raised fluent in Haida. And I'm like, she's an outsider. She didn't even grow up with it, And so I see somebody there, and that's an ally within the community, you know, and not that you have to go and marry into communities, I don't mean that, but about building authentic relationship. How do you show up, you know? And that's really important.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to bring it back to something you mentioned there as well. When you were talking about your experience in the DRC, you mentioned that it came from the spiritual world and it didn't come from another person. I think that's really important in that whole relationship as you go about being an ally, is not looking for validation in other people on that, you know, and that kind of brings in again, and that, what are you there for? What are you taking up that space, right? Why are you there? If you're there to seek validation from a group or from an audience or from whoever it is, then maybe you need to reconsider what you're doing in that space to begin with, right? Which I think is super important. We did have a question from the live audience that was from Ada a little while ago. Many of us want to fit in and feel like we have a lot to offer, but don't feel like fit in or belong, or maybe that we're taking space that doesn't that isn't for us. Would you have any words for Ada about kind of how to navigate that? How do you start to enter into that space, right, where you're feeling like you're a little bit uncomfortable or insecure?
Yeah, I would suggest looking at the uncomfortableness, because that's a place where we don't do that. We often, Ada, check into this place where it's like, yeah, but I've got all this stuff to offer. And it's like, then build the right relationships first. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you're coming in, which is like, that's what colonization is, coming in, even though you're coming to give something, but there's still something which isn't, you're not coming in as an equal. And that's the place, is that everybody is equal, right? And it doesn't matter what people's accolades are, is that we're all equal. And so what are the relationships? And it might take you, you know, way more time to build those relationships, but you'll have least resistance, okay? Because there's a thing that we get into where we've got, okay, well, I have this timeline and I have to do this and I have to do that. And it's like, well, you're gonna just meet with resistance, you know? And that's a fact. And programs don't work because of not having authentic relationships. So I don't know if that answers your question, Ada, if you just want to check in with that. Mm-hmm. But that's the premise of all of our work, is about connecting with each other, you know, and it not being about you. Just recently, I met a woman who has developed this really phenomenal environmental programs for Indigenous people, and she's like, yeah, but it's not happening, and I want it to happen. And I'm like, well, and she's like, can I just give it to you? And maybe it can be used. And I was like, holy smokes, that's, you know, she's like, you don't even have to mention my name. And I'm like, whoa, that was pretty generous of a person whose lifelong work has now come to a place where she's like, actually, she realized it's not mine. And for all the years I've been trying to knock down doors and be like, here, take this. She's like, I've just met with resistance, you know? And so there's a thing there of like, okay, how are we being generous with our time and our energy? You know, are we giving it like this, like a, you know, because we all have learned this method of like, you know, here's a candy as long as you do this, right? If you behave, right? Instead of like, yeah, you will receive this because it's going to help you, right? Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? We have another one from the online. Comes from Naomi. While listening to Reclaimed on CBC, a powerful poem by a First Nations poet was read, I thought of a workshop I facilitated in that I wanted to use the poem. And then I started thinking about permission and some of the things we talked about in terms of cultural appropriation. So she just kind of checking in, how do we keep ourselves in check around what we have the right to access and share and all that sort of stuff?
That's such a great question. Thank you. Because it's a big one, depending on what culture you come from. So the West Coast, there are protocols in how things are held. In some societies on the west end of Canada, or actually all of Canada, there's still secret societies, right? And there are things that are handed down to families, like songs that only a family within a community can sing those songs and hold those songs, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are customs that are held like that. There's also, because we live in a modern time where there's things that happen on the web and it's kind of free source. So my idea is, it's one thing, can you reach out to the poet and ask if you could quote them using honor them by using their poem would be my first. That's what I would do. Hi, I was really inspired by your poem, and I would like to use it for a class I'm teaching. Can I use it with your name on it? And a lot of times people will say yes, and sometimes people will say no. I mean, I ran into that last year 2 years ago at a place where a woman got up and sang a song, and she's like, I have a chant for everybody. And I was thinking, okay, there was like 20 Indigenous people and 110 mostly white people. And this woman got up and started singing the song that we'd been singing all week. And it was just like, oh, and she sang it wrong. And I've been singing this for 15 years. And it was turned it into like a song like this. And everybody in our group was just like, and it was a really great teaching moment because it was like, okay, that's kind of a bit of a problem. Who did you learn it from and where did it come from? And she had no idea. And I'm like, okay, you need to actually have permission from the person who sang it. So, and I gave her the number of the person who I happened to know. And he called me and he said, this woman called me about using the song. He said, I didn't know what it was, but I just said no because I figured if you had sent her to me, she needs to build a relationship with me first, right? Wow. Yeah, and he said, and I'm open to that, but who did you send to me? So it is that, right? It is about how do we do it? Like we know that when you're writing papers, for example, you have to reference where those pieces come from. Now it's an interesting one as when things come from the spirit world, how do you reference that? Academia doesn't like that sort of stuff. It's kind of like, well, hang on a second. It doesn't follow the rules, but, there are no rules, but it's like, what are you doing here? What are you doing from here? Are you doing something that's taking or are you doing something that is like sharing, and really sort of hold that and ask permission. Ask.
Great. Thank you. It checks in and just says, yes, I truly believe that it's all about healthy, trusting relationships, and it does take time. So thanks you very much for that. Do we have any other thoughts from? Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's building on a few of the past questions.
Sure.
But, I know for myself, and I've heard from many colleagues about the fear of making mistakes in this space and just preventing, and like I just better stop because I'll just make a mistake and make it worse.
Yeah, that was one of my other things. Thank you. Actually, that was one of my things on my list that I'm like, what did I write? is know when you've hit your place where you actually have made a mistake and own it. I don't know what to do. I'm in a place where I'm actually have really made a mess and sit with it. And people, because a lot of times people are like, oh, I made a mess. And they avoid it. I didn't do that, right? We see that all the way up in our politics, right? Sweep it under the carpet. And that's the problem. And I just recently went through with an organization who, there was a big, huge thing with POC and people said inappropriate things and it had just turned into something it didn't need to turn. Instead of the person saying, the general manager just saying, actually, I don't know how to handle this right now. That's empathy. That's where people are like, oh. That's why when I step onto people's different territories, I normally start with an apology. Because then they're like, oh, she doesn't know. A Maori friend of mine taught me how to do that, and I'm just like, oh, good. Not that I, say that being ignorant is good, but it is a really important place that you, when you hit the place, you're like, I don't know what to do. And somebody will be like, oh, go talk to so-and-so, go talk to so-and-so, ask them. And so that's a really big one because that shows that you're there to learn. Not just to come in with your, here in this way. Mm-hmm. I've got a great idea to help your community. I actually don't know. So that's my answer. And that was one of the things that I thought was a really good one because that's the impact piece and the place in which you're like causing harm, And so it's like we can cause harm. We do that all the time with each other, but to really be humble enough to be like, I thought this would work and it doesn't. Does anybody have any suggestions? And then you're building relationships, right? We do that, we look at our intimate relationships with our partners. There's lots of things that we have to learn about breaking down those things. Like put the toothpaste away, little things. But I mean, that's not, not really relevant into some of the faux pas that happen. But I think that's a really important, thank you for asking that question, because that's a really important one, is when you don't know, you need to say that.
But to take the first step,
To always take the first step.
relationship.
Relationship, right? Because you're building it, because they don't trust you, so it's like, people are going to be like, that woman over there, we know who she is, and she always messes up. And they might not say that, right? Because it's like you're coming into the community, but if you can be like, I am a bozo on the back of the bus, and I don't know, could you help me? People are going to be like, oh, okay, and people, right? It's true. People will be like, oh, yeah, I remember going into a place where my friend works with, I don't know the proper word, adults with disabilities, with mental disabilities. And everybody there was like, oh, you don't know what's going on. You don't know how to play bingo. Let me show you. And it was one of the funnest days where people in the community held me and brought me along and really make sure that I wasn't left out. And I was like, wow, what a big teaching from this is, of people, being like, this is how you do this. And I was like, oh, thank you. And it was good, right? But that liberation is that it's not coming in and going, yeah, I know, because it's like, we don't know, right? We've been indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking and beliefs.
So just to repeat that question for the live audience and to kind of summarize that a little bit, when we're talking about coming into these spaces and we're worried about making mistakes, how do we kind of approach that? How do we hold that space? And your response to that was just to kind of approach it with humility, above and beyond. Be aware of where you are on that, let's say, the learning journey, so to speak, with that particular community, and prioritize building a relationship first.
Yeah, think of the forest.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions. Claire from the farm, I don't know if you know Claire.
Yeah,
from
hi
the farm. Wonderful discussion, thank you. I wonder if you might be willing to unpack the term ally, which I understand is not always the preferred terminology of how individuals can support Indigenous folks. Allies implies we may be on equal footing, fighting some kind of war together for the same goals.
Yeah.
Do you want to kind of unpack that
Claire,
a little bit?
in a nutshell, I would say, because ally is a loaded word, and it's about building right relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Just simple,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thanks very much, Claire. And we have a question from Colin. Thank you for sharing your stories, firstly. What's your thoughts on immigrant settlers, multi-generational, two recently landed, and allyship? A lot of talk puts white privilege at the front, but there are also immigrant settlers who have a role to play in decolonization, TRC. However, there's marginalization that can occur within these interactions with white spaces' bodies.
Yeah.
As a compelling area to explore, do you have any thoughts you could offer on that?
Interesting. I was just in Surrey on the weekend working with, and there's a difference. I want to acknowledge this part right now because it's really important that we understand this. When you're a settler, if you've lived here, right, for a long time, people are refugees, right? There's a lot of refugees that didn't come here because it was a choice, because they were displaced, which is similar to Indigenous people. I just walked into a room full of like 40 people, and I think there was 2 white people in the room, and I was like, wow, I feel like I'm in Toronto or somewhere like that. And this was the question, and this was the place in which we talked about, which I think is really important for us to think about, is that having opportunities for people to learn. And so then we have to look at the systems that are set up when people come to get their Canadian citizenship and what you have to learn. It's ridiculous. Anybody who's gone through that process, it's absolutely ridiculous. And even within our education systems, what people learn about First Peoples, I mean, they've created this place through the reconciliation process in the principles of learning in the education system, but there's still a resistance to, what does that actually look like? So, yes, I agree that it has to be, we need to include everybody in building those relationships, but education is the forum, right? It is definitely the forum in which we build those relationships, and those relationships are super important.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions, any comments from the live audience? Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to ask a question, but I'll try. I'm thinking also about other like white folks who are like, oh, can you, we need an elder for this video, and I'll be like, tomorrow. I'm like, I don't think that's a respectful thing to do. So I'll say, they didn't get back to me, but like, I kind of need to. How do I work with other people when I don't even feel like I'm totally connected, but they're even less connected. You know what I mean? Like, where do I?
Just kind of, so I can just repeat that question for the live audience so we can kind of follow along. So how do we kind of bridge that gap, let's say, between community members and those that are really disconnected in yourself, particularly if you're occupying a space that maybe you're not as connected to that community to begin with? Is that kind of what it is?
The like Indigenous community.
Yeah, of course.
I kind of want to protect them, but I also feel like I'm not you know, like what's my role there? I'm not
Right. So is that kind of the right
Yeah, I think
relationship?
so.
Okay. So Kim.
So I think that's a place when building those relationships within the communities, but also developing protocols within your organizations and institutions that that have proper, this is how you build right relationships. I was just working in the Haida Nation. I'm like, when you have non-native people coming in here on their contracts, it needs to, these are the protocols that you need to adhere to while you're on our land and working in this community, because we don't do that. So for you, I'm like, and I think that's great that you're like, whoa, no, and we have to build those relationships. But I think that's important because you have all this time, and so it's about making time for it you're building those relationships that are authentic and not like, okay, I'm sure Shane Point gets calls all the time like, hey Shane, can you come and open this thing? Can you do this? And I'm sure lots of elders don't answer the phone because they're just like, it's one of those people again, And so we're not really, we have these concepts of like, okay, well, I need to have an opening, I need to have a land acknowledgement, or I need to have this. Okay, we got to call an elder, and that's so, you can see it's so problematic, right? And so how is it that you're building the relationships, And I know that a lot of spaces when they in the community, they welcome people to come in, to come and be a part, and building those relationships. Like I said, you need to drink a lot of tea, and whatever that is with people. And you actually have to build authentic relationships, because that's the piece. When we talk about reconciliation, it's like, what are your relationships right now with Indigenous people? Otherwise you can say, oh yeah, I saw so-and-so speak. But that's not a relationship. Friends of mine moved here from the States, and they actually wrote to the three, to Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish hereditary chief. They wrote a letter. He's a lawyer and she's an economist. And they wrote a letter saying, we want to acknowledge that we've moved to your land, which I've never seen anybody do, right? They're Americans, and that was really cool because I was like, wow, I can't believe they did this. And they actually wrote saying, hi, we're here on your land, uninvited guests, but we want to acknowledge, thank you for having us on your land. And they sent it out to all the different things. I was like, oh, that was cool. I haven't done that. I'm here. I mean, they don't want a bunch of letters from you, but I was just like, what a great track into stepping into building relationships,
Mm-hmm.
So how are you building your relationship so that you can have the right relation for that, and for people to be able to say no, and to have for somebody going, I don't want to do that, or to have somebody to be like, yeah, please call me, because it helps me. It helps me because a lot of times, when we ask elders and stuff, there's honorariums and stuff, and it helps elders, So it's like, if you build the right relationship, it's not just what's the surface thing. You're doing it in a way that's like, oh, so good to see you,
know? And if I may just kind of contribute to that, particularly as it relates to the other side of it, like how you integrate protocols into your workplace. I know that can be a really difficult thing to do depending on where you are. I know most of us in this setting, in an academic context, UBC has some existing, depending on the faculty you're working in, has some existing elder protocols. So my advice to you would be to look to those faculties or those programs that are a little bit further ahead than the one that you work in, and try to lean on them for support. Ask if you can take a look at them and ask why they have the protocols in place that they do. That would be my recommendation. Because it's absolutely, it's being that person in that space, you're kind of the go-between, is tough, because you're kind of trying to simultaneously build relationships with both sides, right? With the community, so that the community can trust and appreciate your presence there, and that you can contribute back there in a reciprocal relationship, but then also with the institution at large and the people that interact in that. It's a really tough space, so I just wanted to hold my hands up and say, to look towards there, and thank you very much for taking that space. So we have a bunch of questions from the chat. They're getting a little bit They're really excited. So first, Patience.
Hi, Patience.
Yeah, she says, "Hi, my friend. Can you talk about how people claiming to be allies are monetizing that idea? We bring this into the conversation. I've never actually heard of that. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
How being allies are monetizing?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, Patience, what you...
Okay. We'll wait. Patience,
okay.
if you could just elaborate a little bit further in
Yeah.
the chat box, and we can go from there. Noni asked the question, do you have any suggestions or tips for acting in solidarity or allyship in the workplace? So I'm stuck on how to bring those principles into spaces and systems.
Yeah, that's a really... It's funny, we're working on right now, we just got funded from Vancouver Foundation on decolonizing workspaces.
Indigenized?
Yeah.
Yeah,
With
great.
Next Step.
Right on.
And who's under the Canadian Centre for Policy Analysis. And we're like, we don't really have an answer. And they're like, yeah, but it's got to be done. And I'm like, oh, smokes. So it's a challenging question because so what is it? Like, so you need to sit with your community in your workspace to be, what are your agreements that you're adhering to? As a really simple thing. Okay, so then that changes because it has to be changed from a policy level. So if that means your board of directors, and that can be really challenging because I know with the Vancouver School Board, there was a bunch of stuff that just recently went down where I'm going to get hit by the Vancouver School Board, but that's okay. No, around racism and them, eliminating positions that were really important because there's stuff that have gone down in some of the schools recently that are like absolutely horrible and not okay. And the response to it was even more horrible of like, please erase that from your social media, which is like, that's not the way to deal with, overt racism and, violence. It's not okay. And so there's a thing around that. So it's about having to do that work because we have to do that work and there's no easy way around it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Thanks for that. So we have a couple more questions. Well, Patience actually wrote back, to elaborate further, the idea that they're coming into the community claiming to be an ally, manipulating funding and developing proposals for money, but the money actually ends up not going 100% to the community.
There's a thing around that, Patience, that I see it from within our communities and I see it from people coming from outside the communities, whether it's in research or different things,
right,
and how the money is distributed. It's such a big picture thing on, we need to heal. Everybody needs to heal. We don't know how to deal with power. Like, you put all those candies on a table in front of a little kid, they're just gonna like nonstop do that. Financial power, it doesn't matter what kind of power we deal with, our society isn't used to it. And then we get these huge egos when we get like a funding thing that, oh yes, but we're seeing it in our politicians where they're spending money on things that I'm just like, wait a second, you can't have a expense account when we've got, people who don't have housing like that. It's so absurd, but we have this, what is the word? I deserve it, what's the word? Entitlement, thank you, that's the word. We have this entitlement that comes with power. And so it's such a bigger question, Patience, that we'll have to talk about this on the phone. We'll sit in a big tea and talk about it. But it's such a bigger thing because like, how do we deal with power and how do we have accountability? And that's another one I think that comes in, is that we often point fingers about accountability. This comes into the lateral violence piece we talk about, but we're not really willing to hold the accountability piece for ourselves as well, to actually to speak in those moments, to say, hey, what's going on here? I'm uncomfortable, or I've messed up, something's gone wrong here. I can feel it, I don't know what it is. Can we talk about this, right? Such a hard one for people. So those things are such a huge thing, but they've learned it, right? Again, colonization, we've learned it from it taking place. Okay, that's a bigger conversation. Okay, next.
Yes, yeah.
Can I ask a question for the teaching and learning context?
Yeah.
It just sort of popped into my head, but I was thinking about, we work a lot in faculty development supports, we work with instructors, and so I'm thinking about the roles that happen in like, in a teaching and learning context where there's structurally, obviously, like unequal power in that situation, right?
Yeah.
And let's say I'm a teacher and I'm aware of that, and yet I sort of want to be an ally to my students, or I want to be an ally to others like in the university setting or something like that. But I'm aware that I'm holding all this power. So I want to like reach out and be an ally. And then at the same time, I also want to like nurture allyship or learn about it from others. So like maybe I have this intention, but I'm also aware that there's kind of like this structural imbalance of power. How do I negotiate that?
Yeah, that's really, again, this is the square peg, square round hole thing, right? Because how do we do it when institutions are set up in a hierarchical place where you are responsible to fitting in and being a good girl, right? You know, like it's that sort of place in which, and it does. The reality is, you can lose your position, you know, by not stepping in. But so, how do we yield? How do we hold the power? And I think that's that's a bigger context question, because it's like, it's a tenement of our times right now. It's like, how do we hold power, and how do we hold it within these systems that are set up in that way? How do we decolonize how we hold power? So that's a big thing where I'm like, how do you walk with that position? And I've seen people who hold it, but when you start really going, okay, no, I'm empowering you and I'm empowering you. We are a team. I'm the one that's responsible to them. But do you see the switch in that? It's like, so you sitting with your team of people need to be like, how are we going to solve this? You can come in with all the best ideas, but it comes down to the right relationships with your team, so that everybody's on board and everybody's invested, right, for participation. And then that's a movement that is huge, right? So then when you're dealing with, and you know you are accountable to something, but when your whole team is on board, I think that changes it. And it's really hard, I know, because there's some people who are in positions of power who have a lot of resistance to keeping their power and resistance to change, you know. But you know what, we're in a time now globally where we actually don't have a choice. You know, we're seeing whatever's happening south of the border is a great example of that. All of this, you know, patriarchy stuff that's happening is going to implode on itself, and it's going to be horrible. But it's actually really good, because those type of systems that we've been in, you know, need to change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Don't be a good girl.
Yeah. You have another question?
I like that. I like that answer, and I like that question. And something just came to my mind, is my personal experience being a manager position and then losing that management position and getting a management position again taught me that there's an illusion connected with being important in that job.
Mm.
Yeah.
But it's not me.
No.
But I identify with it. I connect with it. I love it. The power is so sweet.
Yeah.
But here's something that goes along with that. And that's the grieving side. When you have a person, or me, having a position in power, and then leaving that position, there's a great feeling of loss, of illusion, even though I know it's there. Mm. But I'm still grieving. I'm grieving leaving that community. And something that I don't think we always realize is that there's a great grieving going along with people in denial of losing their position of privilege in our societies.
Oh,
and then I don't think we recognize the grieving that's going on the other side, that comes out in anger.
It comes out in resistance, right? It comes out in this place, like we're all complicit in this grieving and anger, right? Like all the depression, all things going on, you know, everything is like a radio wave. All the energy that's happening, whether we're conscious or not, this is the thought that is so limiting, is how connected we are, right? So there is all of these things, and there's a fear of like, but I deserve entitlement. I deserve this, but I've had a taste of power, you know. I love this moment where I was teaching in a grade 3 class in East Van, and we said, this was such a beautiful moment where I'm like, we're talking about power and oppression, and all these little hands are like, yeah, my big brothers mean, my big sisters mean. I'm like, oh, for sure. Like, that's where it starts, right? We learn to be like, oh, I'm going to crush you. And I was the youngest, right? So I learned to use my tongue. So there is a piece in that where this little girl puts up her hand and she said, the government and the corporations are trying to build a pipeline through our community. She goes, I'm Nishka. And she said, but they don't understand real power, do they? And I was just like, yeah. And somebody said to me, actually, somebody's response to that was like, oh, that's so a utopian view. How cute. And I'm like, no, actually, you know, like it's one earthquake away from, you know, real power, right? What is real? What is the natural law? What is real power? You know, when we kill ourselves by, you know, poisoning ourselves, which we're doing, you know, and it's like, so at the end of the day, when you look at statistics around people who are like, you know, when they come to the end of their life, you know, what did you feel good about, you know, and it's never about having power, you know, it's never, people they're like, oh, because I had love, I had all these things that are a different place from the perceived power, which is an illusion, right? Which is an illusion of the bigger meta universal picture of infinite, of we get caught into these things, upholding and behaving. My brother is a professor at a university in Ontario, and he's always comes up against the system, but that's just how our family was raised. You know, I'm just like, dude, just participate properly. Like, you're a research guy. What, I don't know what the deal is, right? Science. It's simple, but you know. And he's like, hang on a second, and so I see these things that come up, right? And I'm like, we like that taste, right? And again, it's your ego. Oh, I need that, you know? It's our ego, right? And our ego holds places in the patriarchy of the systems that we're carrying in, you know, and I don't mean to use that word, where people aren't on an equal base, right? We have a place where it's like this hierarchy of power structures, whether it's educational systems, and I'm not saying fight the system, I'm not doing that, but we need to, it's time to restructure the system. I just read an article the other day about the country of Portugal, who were on the brink of economic disaster when the EU went through, and their unemployment rate was 17%. They got a socialist government. All the major Germany, all the big, you know, cities or countries in Europe said they're screwed if they get a socialist government, right? And there was all these things, and now their employment rate has dropped to 7% in 3 years. They put money into social welfare, so medical, decriminalizing drugs, into putting it into a medical model, and all of their statistics are showing something which our capitalist ego model, it's flipped the switch on it, you know, and it's like, hang on a second, I mean, but we have people who are in such resistance to letting go, people who, like the 1%ers, who have, you know, could eliminate all the problems in, you know, a blink of an eye. There's a reason they don't, because it's this fear. It's this inherent fear, right? Of I need to. And so there's another level that we don't look at it in that way, right? We don't look at that fear or that like, ooh, that feels good, you know? And we hold on to those places. So I don't know. It's a big question because I'm not, you know, and I don't think it's going to be resolvable, but I think the resolve is with big empires fall, right? Big empires fall, and we're seeing the empires that we're all accustomed to. You know, you look at the statistics of climate change right now, guess what? This doesn't really matter. What really matters, you know, and it's probably a good thing that there's going to be a cleansing. They call it the Great Turning, you know, that there's going to be a cleansing, you know, and it's not okay. You know, United Nations is looking at creating cities for climate refugees in northern latitudes and other places, like million-person refugee cities. They're looking at that because within 20 years, what's going to be happening? This is the real issue. These are the real things, and yet we're so accustomed to like, oh, but mine, me, you know, or whatever those things are, right? Of power, whatever that is, you know. And so we've created an imbalance in the way that we've been indoctrinated into doing that. So the allyship is coming up to, you know, this because people are tired, who've been in marginalized places. I say at the bottom because I don't want to put it like that, but you know, people who don't have access to the same equal participation within shared systems. That's racism. You know, we know that colonization. We know that there's this thing called the stairway of oppression. Ideas become beliefs, become truths, eventually become policies. When you look at the history of Canada and the policies that exist, ideas become beliefs. Those people are savages. That's us. Become truths. Well, those people are like this. You know, I was in Toronto last year, and I get into the cab, and the guy said, "Oh, you're Native, right?" I'm like, "Yes." And he's like, "Do you drink alcohol?" And I was like, "Oh my God." okay, why? Do you, whatever, like it's interesting that we have these policies and these ideas systemically that keep it in places of separation, and the system works for that, and it works really well, that we don't realize that we're all kind of serfs in a feudal system, where we're giving our money in that way. You look at indigenous cultures and all the way around the world, you don't see that place. Like you look at the West Coast, the potlatch system, your esteem, is from how you give and gift to the community, how you take care of your community. It's not about this is what I have, It is like the chiefs, the traditional chiefs are the people when they throw their potlatches, what are they giving? Now, how is the community, the clans, which is like the part of the communities, we have to give gifts to give everybody so that they can have food for the winter, they can have these things. In different parts of the world, you can go into Nepal, you can go to different places where people have this same, indigenous people have these same philosophies, but they're not based on a resource extraction. And I mean, we live in a resource extraction place, but how can we adopt some of the values, to start turning the system? And it's hard. It's hard. That's the problem. It's hard work. That's my answer.
Mm-hmm. So we have one more question from the online audience. Talking a little bit about social media now. Social media can be a great place to share about things you care about and encourage others to unpack things or act, etc. Do you have any ideas for holding yourself accountable to share, again, on a social media platform in a way that is genuinely helpful versus maybe just performative or, lip service, I guess?
Do you know what? It's so hard when it's written on a flat screen to feel what you actually mean. Because people take things, in a text in a moment like that, often if things, I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, because there's a lot of, when you look at the comments section on any, whether it's social media or the newspaper, it's kind of horrific. It's really depressing when you see people's responses to whether it's oil and gas, whether it's to refugee people, whether it's to indigenous people. There's something that happens, even if I can say something really good, but it creates this fighting, which isn't like, we get into these things that's like, that's not really the issue. The system is set up for us to do that. And that's the problem. But the real life places, I think, are really important. And social media is a role, I can't deny that. That whole world is really important. People grow up on that now. There's a whole bunch of, they're called native, what are the kids called who are born in the time of computers?
Digital natives.
Digital natives, thank you. There's a whole bunch in this room. Digital natives, right? Who, can explore that in ways that I'm like, well, there are benefits, whether we can also see the shadow, hideous side of that as well, and can we control it? I don't know, but, the real thing is about our relationships.
Cool. Great. So if we have one last question, yeah.
I'm going to try and ask this question. You talk about building authentic relationships, and with that comes vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
And holding the space for that. And in my culture here on campus, there isn't a culture like that, where there is sharing of personal experience or stories. And so I was wondering if you had advice about sort of the path to changing that. And it's a huge culture shift. So I'm in engineering, and there isn't that,
Right.
that personal connection. My partner's a psychotherapist, and they have check-ins every day. I'm like, that's weird, so I wish we had that in engineering. We don't. So, your experience in sort of changing that culture of openness and, being more authentic. And I try to model authenticity, of course, myself, but it is vulnerable. And, how do you wrestle with that? How do you navigate that? And, how do you sort of help to create an open space that allows that?
If I may, just for our online audience to make sure. The act of developing these positive relationships is a very vulnerable thing, and a lot of institutionalized or academic spaces, that's not acceptable. Not necessarily that it isn't acceptable, but it isn't seen, right? So the question is how do you kind of navigate making the spaces on campus more open to those kind of vulnerable relationships, right? So then thereby maybe gaining proficiency in how to navigate those relationships. Is that kind of what we're getting at? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so two
Sorry.
questions, and they're kind of they're both tongue in cheek. One is, what's wrong with vulnerability? Actually, that's not tongue in cheek. What's wrong with vulnerability, right? Again, when you look at the systems, how we're raised, and this goes a lot of cultures, different cultures. It's we're raised from this of like, I need to block, I need to perform. It's performative, right? And instead of allowing. So worldviews with Indigenous people is like, who are you? Show us who you are. You know, in the world of, let's say, engineering, right? It's very much, it's so, that's not the right word. I gotta come up with a better word. I want to say obtuse, and I say that because my father designed things. So, but it's not, right? It's a different type of creativity, right? And so, how do you create authentic connections? I'm not quite sure. So then, I would ask you, is what can you do as a teaching form? You know, you have your their methodology of which you need to get information out, but you're also responsible for that. So what's the container that you can create for your students to actually have skills in which they're creating connections other than going maybe to the pub and drinking beer or something like that? I don't know, but that are authentic, you know, especially when you have foreign students, you have people coming from all over, you know, so then it is actually your responsibility. It's taking that responsibility and accountability to doing that, you know, and I love how my father would like, that's a really woo-woo moment, you know, and I'm like, yeah, but Dad, you love it, you know, because we all do secretly. That's funny. I work with a really amazing young man who's an engineer who's working in the field of social justice. And he's like, environmental. And he's like, I really don't have any idea. I'm like, oh, that's so awesome. You know how to build things, right? And he's like, well, yeah, I can structure things. I'm like, perfect. We need somebody who can build structure. And then with these ideas, these concepts. So what sort of concepts are you bringing into engineering rather than the traditional output, here you go, that are revolutionary? You know, there's a whole field of engineering around biomimicry and things like that, or sustainable, you know, where is it coming that we're connecting for the human place? Because not everybody's going to be doing this work, you know, giving hugs and things like that, right? It's true. But what are the things in which you can use from creating people's knowledge to not just outputting to create stuff? You know, I have a friend who's a mechanical engineer, and he's like, I don't like my job because I just create stuff. He creates, you know, and I'm like, yeah, but you create cool stuff. Like, what is that? And but it's like, how are we decolonizing those spaces into creating things that actually matter? And so it might not be in this interaction, but it's like, you know, the teamwork that you see in engineering departments where they come in, they have to make something. You know, I've only seen it on places, and so like, but things that matter, not just stuff, like, so that are affecting change and connection within communities, right? Like, why are we not in renewable? You know, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make the space for it.
Yeah. I think just to kind of build on that, it seems like you're talking a little bit about re-looking at the way that we build relationships, even within the context that you have, engineering working teams and those sorts of things, encouraging people to develop that and creating your own space, as you mentioned that you already do, right, and modeling that vulnerability as much as you can. It's just about kind of holding that space, I think, and being strong in who you are and what you believe in. And eventually people are going to come to it, right?
Here's something, I just thought about this, is that years ago, where I was having a dialogue with a pretty big institution, academic institution out in Ontario, kind of one of the old school ones, the fancy ones, I'll say that, I won't say the name of the university. And then one on the island that is like, we want to do it too, is they actually, for their MBAs, want to take them for a week on the land, because it's like all these people are being flushed out through the MBA programs and working for corporations and stuff like that. But it's like, if they don't have a connection, authentic connection, they're like, what if we start taking people for part of their curriculum for either 1 week or 3 weeks? Their curriculum is, because I know that their UBC has Loon Lake, you know, where it's actually a place of play and connection. Mm. And it is, and you have to build a bridge into why it's important for engineers to have that. You know, so it's possible. I mean, the powers that be might be a little bit like, but you know, change is good, donkey. You can use those words from Shrek, right? You know, right? Patience knows that one, right? And so it's a really important thing. Is like, so how am I doing it? You know, and so it's going to be like pushing, but it's like we're responsible for, if we're working with other people, you know, how are we affecting them? Or are we just shooting out the same, right? That are perpetuating the same, you know?
Mhm.
And so that would be my answer.
Awesome. So we have officially run out of time today. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody in the online audience, as well as everybody that was able to join us here in person, for engaging in this circle and in this conversation. It was wonderful, and I loved hearing all of the questions that we had today. There were things that came up that I wouldn't even have thought of, and that's the beauty of being in circle with each other. Obviously, is engaging with one another and learning from each other. So with that, and I want to thank you very much, Kim, for your time coming in and chatting with us today. A quick plug for the Learning Circle. We have a number of really cool sessions coming up. We have next week is functional medicine, and that's kind of looking at the way that nutrition can play on medicine and on other factors. Within the month, we have sessions on Indigenous healthy masculinity as well as healthy femininity. We're really excited about those sessions, and we have a few more, one on medicinal cannabis as well. So please check our website for any of those updates. So again, thank you all very much, and you have a great day.
Thank you.